Hello and welcome to Lecture 4, Viruses and Prions. This lecture is pretty big because it tries to help you see what a virus is, and a virus is a fundamentally weird alien thing. I don't mean they're from outer space, I just mean that they are nothing like cells, even though they are built out of the same things cells are built out of. So I want you to understand that by the time you're done with this. So we're going to start with the big picture slides to maybe change the way you think about it going into the details, and then we'll go into the details. So let's get into it. What is the big picture on viruses? What are they? And I know you might think about the diseases they cause, but that's not what we're looking at here. Right now we're looking at the viruses themselves. And you have to think about the human or the host and its immune system to really understand the diseases. So this is just, what are the viruses? What do they do? And a virus really is information. And you'll see some viruses exist only as information. They are the information required to reprogram a host cell to transmit that virus. That's really the most essential thing a virus is. It's the set of instructions to reprogram a host cell to make more virus and spread it. So this can be confusing because you've probably seen lots of pictures of quote-unquote viruses. There are beautiful pictures, three-dimensional structures of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID-19. But that's not the virus. That's part of a viral life cycle. That's called a virus particle, or a virion. So I'm going to call it a virion. And that's the physical structure that moves from person to person. That's what initially infects you if you get COVID-19. Those virions get into you. If enough of those get into you and infect your cells, then you get that disease. So those virions are the physical structure a virus takes when it's outside of a host cell. So the way I think about it is just a physical structure that transmits the information to the next host cell. And the information is always going to be in the form of a nucleotide sequence, like DNA or RNA. It's just the instructions for controlling a cell. DNA controls a cell. So what is a virion? What does it carry with it? I like to use this dandelion analogy. This is a really beautiful picture of a dandelion. And what you're seeing is those dandelion seeds being blown away on the wind. And a virion is like a seed in many ways I want you to see. It's a physical structure that has no ability to control where it goes, but if it goes the right place, it can create a whole new virus, just like the dandelion seeds can create a whole dandelion. So those seeds from that dandelion, just this little seed contains enough DNA to make every kind of cell and all of these structures. It can program this entire plant to make the entire plant. That's all in this seed. Every cell in this plant has the same DNA, except the sex cells, but all the other cells have the same DNA, just like this. And so the point of one of these seeds is just to carry that DNA to a new place to start a new plant. And that's exactly what a virion does. It just carries the nucleic acid to a host cell. It has no other abilities and no other function. And so since virions have no other function and no other ability, they're really not like cells. Cells can grow and divide and do metabolism and explore. Virions cannot. So they really are best thought of as something like a seed. And we're looking at this big picture, but we're really going to get down into some details about viruses to help you get a better picture in your mind about what they are. And so part of this will be understanding what the host cell does with the virus, because that's a big part of the virus life cycle. The host cell making virions is a huge part of the virus life cycle. or I should say replication cycle. Viruses aren't alive, but I don't care about things like are they alive or not. So a big part of that cycle is in the host cell, and then part of the cycle is a virion outside of the host cell. So we're going to look at what happens in a host cell, but first we're going to look at the virion structures. So we'll get to that in a minute. Remember, proteins are encoded by DNA. A protein is, well, you tell me. Pause the video and tell me what a protein is. A protein is a chain of amino acids, and which amino acid goes next in the chain is very important. That determines everything about the protein. And the cell knows which amino acid comes next because that's what the DNA encodes. That's what the sequence of nucleotides in DNA and RNA is for. It's to specify which amino acid comes next in a protein. So each virus has its own genome, and that's a nucleic acid. It's weird because some of them just have RNA. They don't even have DNA. But they all have some kind of nucleic acid that can encode all their proteins and instruct a host cell in how to do it. So viruses, their genomes are going to encode several different kinds of proteins. Structural proteins are virion parts, proteins that go in virions. And so there are also non-structural proteins, and those would be like polymerase enzymes. RNA viruses generally need their own enzymes for copying their genomes. They also have a whole bunch of other enzymes that just change the way the cell behaves, or they interact with the cell in ways that are very difficult for us to predict. But you can always predict they're going to have regulatory proteins that are going to help start and stop translation and things like that inside a cell. So again, I'm going to want you to be able to explain the difference between a virus and a cell. There are so many differences. They are not alike in any way, except some of their physical structures. So a virion, we can go through a long list of things virions don't do that cells do. I guess I will. So they don't divide. Virions don't divide. They don't grow bigger and then make daughter cells. They don't have ribosomes. They don't make their own proteins, and they don't have metabolic activity. They're not doing glycolysis or the citric acid cycle. They don't have electron transport chains. They don't do respiration. They have no need for that because a virion is made using energy from a host cell. Actually, this is something you might not have heard, but one of the most fundamental things in every cell on the planet is the ability to make a charge gradient across its membrane. Every cell on the planet can do that, whether they're obligate anaerobes or aerobes or whatever. They can all charge their membranes. But virions don't do that. They don't have a reason to do that. Virions can't move. They don't release signals that communicate with other virions. They don't generally secrete any toxins or anything else. They don't pump proteins out of the virion the way bacteria do, the way human cells do. And they're immune to antibiotics and antivirals. Think about that. A virion is immune to antivirals. So antiviral drugs do not target virions. The virion is inert, and there's nothing an antiviral drug can do to it. Antiviral drugs are going to target the virus replication cycle, what goes on in a host cell or in a host. And virions are immune to antibiotics because antibiotics specifically target enzymes in bacteria, and virions don't have any of those enzymes. So in that way, they're very different from cells. That's a pretty good list. I recommend going back to that list later on as you've gone through the virus replication cycle. Come back to this list and use it to review the things you've learned. Another thing we can think about that we won't come back to in much detail is what does a virus do to its host? And the answer is generally nothing good. The worst case scenario is killing the cell or triggering a dangerous immune response. And that happens in humans. If you get a virus, most of the symptoms you experience are your immune response. You can't generally feel anything the virus does. What you feel is, swelling, or you feel malaise. That's because your brain is sending out signals to make you feel that way. It's not anything the virus is actually doing to you. Those immune responses are a big deal in humans. Some viruses mess around with the host cell DNA and trigger mutations. And so some viruses are able to cause cancers that way. Others just hide in the DNA, as we will see. So the last part of this video is going to be just going through the parts of a virion. And I realize that makes for a long video. This is essential. We're going to look at viral replication, and a big part of viral replication is making the parts that go into a virion. So we're going to look at what those parts are so that we can keep coming back to what a virus has to do to replicate itself. So what it says on this slide is a great thing to remember. The virion does not replicate by itself. It doesn't grow and divide. It is a helpless little thing that just delivers a nucleic acid to a host cell. That's all it does. So let's look at the parts of a virion. First of all, they're very small. So all the viruses I could name are too small to see with a light microscope. So something the size of a big smallpox virus would look like a dot, and you wouldn't be even sure it's a dot if you saw it under a microscope. And most other viruses are smaller than that. Most virions, I should say, are smaller than that. And so what structures do they have? Let's go through a list. They all have a genome, because at their core, this is the most essential part of a virion and of a virus at all. The genome, either DNA or RNA, which encodes all of its proteins and encodes the instructions for reprogramming a host cell. It's also going to have a capsid, and this is a shell of protein that protects the nucleic acids. Viral capsids are cool. They're these geometric shapes made up of little proteins that spontaneously form that geometric shape around the nucleic acid. So those proteins are called capsomeres, and they are really what's amazing because they spontaneously attach to other capsomeres, and many times they attach to the nucleic acid. And if you get enough of them together, they will just spontaneously wrap up that nucleic acid and protect it in a protein coat. So hundreds of capsomeres come together to make a capsid. A lot of viruses have more complex virions that may have multiple capsids. And so these have yet another protein layer around all of that that holds various pieces together. So there may be a capsid, there may be some enzymes the virus is going to need to help it get into a host cell, and those might be protected by matrix proteins. So matrix proteins are another one of the structures. No, I won't say that. A large number of viruses have viral envelopes. And viral envelopes are essentially lipids, lipid membranes that the host cell has made for them. Sometimes they're stolen from the host cell membrane. Sometimes they're just kind of assembled around the virus, but they look like a cell membrane, but they don't have the same job a cell membrane has. So that's a virus envelope. And then every virus has spike proteins. Spike proteins are the outermost layer of a virion, and they are what interacts with the outside of a host cell. So what we will see as we go through the viral replication cycle is that spike proteins are critical for infecting cells. And if you read or listen to articles about the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, you will certainly hear about spike proteins and their evolution. So there are a lot of different shapes of capsids. The most common ones we see are either a helix, and what a helix shows is the capsomeres have just wrapped up the nucleic acid inside them. And in other cases, icosahedral, 20-sided proteins made of 60 or something like that capsomeres. Related viruses will have the same capsid shape, and so it's a little bit useful in telling that two viruses are similar. Capsomeres are these amazing little proteins that, again, spontaneously make the capsid. So they don't need to be put together by some other enzyme. They just do it. And in some viruses, they just grab onto the nucleic acid and each other and form a capsid that just beautifully protects the nucleic acid. That's the job of a capsomere. In some viruses, it's complicated, like influenza A viruses have 8 genome segments. So their genome is split into 8 pieces. And within a single virion, each piece, each genome segment has its own capsid. And then the whole thing is surrounded by a matrix and then by an envelope. It's complicated. So the capsomeres that make up that have to be able to spontaneously become part of one of those 8 segments. I mentioned viral envelopes, and these are a big deal for viral replication. They're made by the host cell, just like every other part of the virion. And in some cases, they're stolen from the host cell membrane. Sometimes they come from the nuclear membrane, and sometimes the virus makes the host cell form a vesicle, and they put the capsid in that. And so the envelope was formerly a vesicle. So a viral envelope is always going to be a phospholipid bilayer. And its general function at its most basic is to keep the capsid from drying out, to prevent desiccation. So many of them, well, an enveloped virus will always have spike proteins embedded in the envelope. And those spike proteins, we have to be careful here. Most virus spike proteins are encoded by the viral genome, so they are viral proteins. And they evolve quickly to get around the immune response. We can contrast that with some other things you might find in an envelope, because some viruses steal proteins from the host cell to use as camouflage. So some viruses will steal parts of the host membrane and whatever's in it, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and wear it. So influenza, for example, its envelope is just stolen from the host cell membrane, and it has both influenza spike proteins and then everything else a host cell membrane would have. So it can kind of mimic being a host cell in that way. And then, like I said, not all viruses have envelopes. From what I've seen, it is broadly like half of viruses have enveloped virions and half don't. And the ones that don't have envelopes are called naked virions, or naked viruses. So we are going to keep thinking about enveloped viruses because they are very important to us, and I want to show you sort of why. The first part is that some of them, like what influenza has, the envelope tricks our immune system because it identifies the virion as a host cell, even though it isn't. They also are involved in how a virion gets into a host cell. So that's something we will see later, is the envelope can be involved in viral penetration. They also keep the virion from drying out, so enveloped viruses can be stable in the environment. But then their weakness is that they're easy for us to destroy with disinfectants and hand sanitizer and soap. All that stuff, anything that damages a lipid membrane is going to damage a viral envelope. And so hand sanitizer can protect you from virions on your hand because it can damage their envelope. But a naked virus won't be damaged by hand sanitizer. That's why norovirus, you're told to wash your hands, not to use hand sanitizer, because norovirus doesn't care about hand sanitizer. But something like SARS-CoV-2 or influenza, these are enveloped viruses, and if you damage the envelope, the virion cannot penetrate a host cell. So the envelope both helps the virus, but also gives us some ways to inactivate the virion. And that is it for this long video, which I'm glad you watched the whole thing or listened to the whole thing, because these virion parts are something we're going to keep talking about, and that big picture is something we're going to keep talking about. So thank you. I'll see you in the next video.